Chapter 1. The Anonymous Letter. Rain fell incessantly over the city, turning the streets into rivers of asphalt. Streetlights flickered, casting a dull glow on the puddles. It was a typical night for Detective Jake Malone, who had taken refuge in his office on the 5th floor of an old building. The smell of tobacco and cold coffee filled the air, mingling with the soft jazz playing from an old turntable in the corner of the room. Jake Malone, in his early 40s, had seen it all. His black hair, now flecked with gray, was a testament to long nights and difficult cases. His blue eyes, once vibrant and piercing, now held a tired but still attentive look. He sank into his worn leather chair, watching the cigarette smoke rise in lazy spirals. That night, however, something different was about to happen. Malone didn't know it yet, but fate was about to hand him a mystery unlike any other. The office doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. He frowned and got up, straightening his tie. He opened the door and found a hooded figure, drenched from the rain, holding an envelope. Before Malone could speak, the figure pushed the envelope into his hands and disappeared into the darkness of the corridor. Back in the safety of his office, Jake studied the envelope. There was no return address, only his name, Jake Malone, written in an old-fashioned script. He carefully broke the seal and pulled out a yellowed letter. Dear Detective Malone, there are secrets in this city that have been buried, but never died. I am the Alchemist, and you are about to uncover a legacy of terror. 20 years ago, a killer left a trail of blood and mystery. This man had a son, and now that son is ready to continue his work. Find him before it's too late. The Alchemist. Jake read and reread the letter, feeling a chill run down his spine. The Alchemist, a name not heard for 2 decades, but still carrying a shadow of fear. He knew he couldn't ignore this. Suddenly, mystery had entered his life again, and he was determined to uncover the truth. As he pondered his next step, a flash from the past surfaced. He remembered the Alchemist case, one of the most gruesome and intricate the city had ever seen. The killer was a master chemist, turning common substances into instruments of death. Each crime was a morbid work of art, left as a riddle for the authorities. Malone hadn't worked directly on the case, but he knew enough to understand the magnitude of the threat. The Alchemist's son was loose, and he needed to be stopped before the terror began anew. He picked up the phone and dialed a familiar number. Evelyn? This is Malone. I need information on the old Alchemist case. Yes, that one. I have a feeling we're about to revisit some old nightmares. He hung up and looked out the window, the city gleaming under the relentless rain. A new hunt was beginning, and Jake Malone was at the center of it. He lit another cigarette and prepared to dive into a world of secrets and shadows, where every clue could be the key to unraveling a legacy of horror. And so, with the cigarette smoke dissipating in the humid air of the office, Detective Malone began his journey, knowing that the real mystery was just beginning. Chapter 2. The Dark Past. The morning arrived cold and gray, a reflection of the thoughts that troubled Jake Malone's mind. Sitting at his desk with coffee growing cold beside him, he sifted through the old, dusty files on the Alchemist case. Grainy crime scene photos, newspaper clippings, and autopsy reports lay scattered before him, each one telling a part of a macabre story. The Alchemist, whose real name was Edward Blackwood, had been a brilliant chemist, a genius who turned to crime with cold and meticulous skill. His murders were complex, nearly impossible to decipher. The police had never caught him, and then one day he simply vanished. His trail of blood and fear remained, an unsolved mystery that became legend in the city. Jake remembered how that case had haunted the city. It was a time of fear, where each new murder seemed more grotesque than the last. The name of the Alchemist was whispered with horror in bars and markets. And now, the ghost of that dark time was back in the form of an anonymous letter. Malone! A deep voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Evelyn Hart, his old friend and reliable source at the precinct. She entered the office, carrying a stack of new documents. Evelyn, it's good to see you, said Malone, standing up to greet her. What do you have for me? Not much, she replied, dropping the papers on his desk. But these are all the unclassified reports on the Alchemist. Most of the files are still sealed. Old Harrison doesn't want to open anything. Thinks it'll just reopen old wounds. Jake snorted. That case was a nightmare then. Now, it looks like it's about to get worse. Evelyn nodded. Do you really think his son is out there, ready to follow in his father's footsteps? I don't know, said Jake, staring at an old photo of the Alchemist. But the letter was convincing. And if there's a chance it's true, we can't ignore it. Evelyn sighed, crossing her arms. So, where do we start? First, we need to understand who Edward Blackwood was before he became the Alchemist. Then, we need to find out what happened to him after he disappeared. Is there any mention of his family in these documents? Evelyn picked up one of the reports and quickly skimmed through it. Very little. It's known that he was married and had a son, but their identities were protected. The wife disappeared soon after his escape, and the son, well, no one knows for sure what happened to him. Jake frowned. We need to find any clue about that child. If the son is following in his father's footsteps, it means he must have some connection to the Alchemist's methods. And if he's already started acting? Evelyn asked, concern evident in her voice. Then we're racing against time, Jake responded, determined. Every minute counts. Jake spent the morning immersed in the reports, absorbing every detail. Among the pages, he found something intriguing. An undelivered letter addressed to a woman named Clara. The handwriting was the same as the anonymous letter he had received. Evelyn, look at this, he said, showing her the letter. Clara, do you think she could be the Alchemist's wife? Maybe, replied Evelyn, studying the handwriting. But why would he write to her now? And why use the same style to send you the letter? Jake pondered for a moment. Perhaps it's a clue. Maybe Clara knows something that can help us. We need to find her. Evelyn grabbed her coat. Let's start the search. Every second that passes could mean another life in danger. Malone nodded, preparing to leave. The mystery was deepening, and the race against time was beginning. The Alchemist's legacy was proving to be more complex and dangerous than he could have imagined, and the detective knew that this time, failure was not an option. Chapter 3. An Unexpected Encounter. Night enveloped the city in its cloak of darkness, bringing a biting cold that cut through coats and chilled the skin. The streets were silent, save for the distant sound of a saxophone echoing from a jazz bar. Jake Malone, his trench coat and hat soaked from the rain, walked with firm steps, his mind absorbed in thoughts about Clara and the Alchemist. The Blue Note, a bar hidden in a narrow alley, was known for its talented musicians and eclectic clientele. Malone entered, greeted by the stuffy warmth and cigarette smoke that filled the air. The room was dimly lit with faint, colorful lights, creating a scene of dancing shadows and silhouettes. Seated in a dark corner, Malone observed. His experience had taught him to read people and situations, and he knew this night would be no different. Evelyn had informed him that someone here might have information about Clara. He needed to stay vigilant, as danger could lurk anywhere. "A drink, sir?" asked a blonde waitress with a tired look, breaking Malone's concentration. "Whiskey neat," he replied, his eyes still scanning the room. The soft saxophone music seemed to tell a sad story, reflecting the detective's state of mind. The drink arrived quickly, and Malone sipped it slowly, still on alert. Then he noticed a man sitting at the bar, wearing a long coat and a hat that partially concealed his face. There was something familiar about the man's posture, something that piqued Malone's curiosity. Rising calmly, he approached the bar and sat beside the man. "Nice night for a drink, don't you think?" Malone said, striking up a conversation. The man turned slowly, revealing a face marked by time and weariness. His eyes were dark and deep, holding ancient secrets. "Depends on the reason for the drink," he replied in a rough voice. "I'm looking for answers," said Malone, staring at him. "And I heard someone here might be able to help me with that." The man let out a bitter laugh. "Answers are hard to come by in this city, detective. But I might have some for you, if you're willing to pay the price." Malone frowned. And what would that price be? Information for information, the man said, leaning in. You're looking for Clara, aren't you? The alchemist's wife. Jake felt a chill down his spine. How do you know that? I know many things, the man said, taking a sip of his drink. And I know where you can find Clara. But first, I want to know what you've discovered about the alchemist's son. Malone hesitated for a moment. Revealing too much could be dangerous, but he needed the information. I received a letter. It said the alchemist's son is following in his father's footsteps. I'm trying to prevent more deaths. The man nodded, seeming to ponder. Very well, detective. Clara is hiding, living under a false name. She's afraid of being found, both by her son and by the police. But you can find her at the old warehouse on 17th Street, where she works as a cleaner. Jake noted the information, but before he could thank him, the man continued. But be careful, detective. Not everything is as it seems. Clara has her own secrets, and you might not like what you discover. Malone nodded. Thanks for the tip. And what about you? What's your role in this story? The man laughed, standing up. Just a shadow from the past, detective. Just a shadow. With those enigmatic words, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving Malone alone at the bar. The detective finished his whiskey and stepped out into the cold night, with a new lead to follow. The warehouse on 17th Street was his next destination, and he knew the truth about the alchemist and his son was getting closer to being revealed. As he walked through the rain, Malone reflected on the encounter. Who was that mysterious man? And what secret was Clara hiding? The answers awaited him, but he needed to be prepared to face the shadows of the past and the threats of the present. The mystery deepened, and Jake Malone, with his sharp instincts and unwavering determination, was ready to unravel it, even if it meant confronting the darkest demons of the city. Chapter 4. The Alchemist's Diary. The rain had diminished to a fine drizzle as Jake Malone approached the old warehouse on 17th Street. The windows were covered in dust and cobwebs, and the faded red brick walls told stories of decades past. He paused at the entrance, the silence around him broken only by the sound of his own footsteps echoing on the concrete ground. Clara, he murmured, trying to visualize the woman he was about to meet. The alchemist's wife, now hiding under a false name. She was the key to uncovering the secrets that haunted the city. Jake pushed the door open with a creak. Inside, the warehouse was nearly deserted, save for a few piles of boxes and rusty equipment. In a corner, a frail and tired figure was sweeping the floor. Her gray hair and cleaner's uniform couldn't hide the elegance that must have once been her hallmark. Clara? Jake called out, his voice echoing through the empty space. The woman stopped, looking at him with eyes that revealed both fear and surprise. Who are you? What do you want? Her voice was weak but determined. My name is Jake Malone. I'm a detective. I'm here because of your husband, Edward Blackwood, he said, stepping forward slowly so as not to frighten her. Clara backed away, clutching the broom tightly. Edward is dead. What do you want with him? I received a letter, Jake said, pulling the yellowed envelope from his pocket and showing it to her. From the alchemist. It says your son is following in his footsteps. I need your help to find him before he hurts anyone else. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she maintained her composure. My son. I tried to protect him, to keep him away from all this. But he is like his father. Do you know where he is? Jake asked, watching her closely. Clara hesitated, looking around as if the walls could hear. I haven't seen him in years, but he left something behind, something that might help. Come with me. She led Jake down a narrow corridor to a locked room. Taking a key from her pocket, Clara unlocked the door and stepped inside, revealing a small room filled with books and old papers. Edward kept a diary, Clara said, pulling a thick, worn notebook from a shelf. He recorded everything here. His thoughts, his plans, everything about the murders. I hid it to protect my son, but perhaps it's time to reveal the truth. Jake took the diary, feeling the weight of the yellowed pages in his hands. This could be the key to finding your son and stopping this madness. Clara nodded, her eyes filled with sadness. But be careful, detective. The diary is full of codes and riddles. Edward was a brilliant man, but also extremely dangerous. Deciphering this won't be easy. Jake ran his fingers over the pages, seeing chemical formulas, diagrams, and detailed notes. I'll need help to understand this. I know someone who can help, Clara said. An old colleague of Edward's. She's a cryptographer and can decode these codes. Her name is Dr. Abigail Watson. She works at the local university. Thank you, Clara, Jake said, placing the diary in his bag. I'll find Dr. Watson, and I promise, I'll do everything I can to stop your son. Clara sighed, visibly relieved. I hope you can, detective, because if he truly follows in his father's footsteps, no one will be safe. Jake left the warehouse, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. The drizzle had stopped, but the city was still shrouded in a thick fog. He knew that every minute was crucial. With the Alchemist's diary in hand and a new lead to follow, he was determined to decipher the secrets before more blood was shed. As he walked down the quiet street, the image of Clara and her deep sadness stayed with him. The Alchemist's legacy was darker and more complex than he had imagined, and the race against time was just beginning. Jake Malone was ready to face the challenges ahead, knowing that each discovery brought him closer to the truth and the justice he sought. And so, with the diary in hand, he headed to the university, where new answers and dangers awaited him. Chapter 5. Deciphering the Code. The local university, with its Gothic towers and labyrinthine hallways, seemed like a setting from an old novel. Jake Malone felt a bit out of place as he walked through the silent corridors, carrying the Alchemist's diary as if it were a sacred artifact. The walls were adorned with portraits of illustrious scholars, their vigilant gazes following the detective's every step. Dr. Abigail Watson's office was at the end of a hallway lit only by the dim glow of fluorescent lights. Malone stopped before the solid wooden door and took a deep breath before knocking. In seconds, the door opened, revealing a middle-aged woman with short hair and thin-framed glasses. Her green eyes shone with keen curiosity, the mark of a mind always in search of new enigmas to solve. "Detective Malone, I presume?" she said, extending her hand. "I'm Dr. Abigail Watson." Clara called and said, "You need my help." "Nice to meet you, Dr. Watson," Malone replied, shaking her hand. "I have something here that needs deciphering." He handed her the diary, watching as the cryptographer flipped through the pages with growing interest. "Impressive," she murmured. "Edward was always brilliant with codes and riddles. This diary is a work of art in terms of cryptography. It will take some time, but I believe I can help." "We don't have much time," Malone said, the urgency in his voice clear. "Every minute counts. The Alchemist's son is on the loose, and I fear he may be following in his father's footsteps." Abigail nodded, adjusting her glasses. "I understand. I'll start immediately." She moved to a desk cluttered with papers, books, and scientific instruments, switching on a lamp for better visibility. Jake settled into a nearby chair, watching as Abigail worked with almost surgical precision. The room was silent, broken only by the sound of pages turning and her quick notes. Edward used a combination of substitution and transposition ciphers, Abigail explained after some time. There are also references to chemical elements that likely have hidden meanings. It's an intricate puzzle, but we're starting to see a pattern. Jake leaned forward, interested. "What have you found so far?" "Well, look at this," she said, pointing to a page filled with symbols. "This sequence here refers to a specific location. It appears to be an address, or perhaps coordinates. It could be where he's hiding," Jake pondered, "or where he plans to commit his next crime." Abigail continued to work tirelessly, translating the codes into readable information. "Here's something else interesting," she said after a few hours. "There are mentions of various chemical compounds that Edward used. This could give us a clue about how his son intends to act." Jake frowned, trying to connect the dots. "So we have a possible location and methods, but we need more details. Who is this kid?" And why is he doing this? Abigail sighed, closing the diary for a moment. Edward's mind was complex, but there's an underlying motivation in all this. He saw the murders as a form of purification, a distortion of ancient alchemical principles. If the son is following in the father's footsteps, he might share the same distorted view. Jake nodded, reflecting on her words. We need to find this kid before he hurts anyone else. Keep deciphering. Any clue could be crucial. As Abigail returned to her work, Jake took out his phone and called Evelyn. Evelyn, I need you to find everything you can about possible hideouts used by Edward Blackwood. We have a lead, but we need more information to act. I'm on it, Jake, Evelyn replied. I'll send everything I find as soon as possible. The night wore on, and fatigue began to weigh on Jake and Abigail. But their determination remained steadfast. As more codes were deciphered, the picture of the Alchemist's son's plan began to take shape. Jake knew they were getting closer to a crucial revelation. Finally, Abigail exclaimed, Here it is, a name, Jonathan Blackwood. It seems he took on a false identity and is operating under this name. Jonathan Blackwood, Jake repeated, feeling a chill down his spine. Now we have a name. We need to find him and stop this once and for all. With new information in hand, Jake Malone left the university, determined to follow every lead to the end. The shadow of the alchemist still loomed over the city, but the detective was ready to face the challenge and bring the truth to light. Time was running out, but Jake knew the battle was just beginning. Chapter 6. The Next Victim. Jake Malone left the university with hurried steps, the name Jonathan Blackwood pounding in his mind. The alchemist's son was closer than he had ever imagined. Armed with this new information, he knew he had to act quickly. The rain had stopped, but the city was still shrouded in a dense fog, reflecting the mystery that still hung over the case. Back at his office, Jake called Evelyn. Evelyn, I need you to run a comprehensive search on Jonathan Blackwood. Anything we can find on him, address, history, connections, and see if you can find any links to the recent victims. I'm on it, Jake, Evelyn replied on the other end of the line. I'll prioritize this now. While he waited, Jake went through the alchemist's diary again, trying to find any detail that might have been overlooked. Each page seemed like a labyrinth of secrets, but he was determined to decipher every one of them. A few hours later, the phone rang. Jake, I found some information, Evelyn said. Jonathan Blackwood has a registered address in an old neighborhood, but it doesn't seem to be the only place he might be. And I found something else, a potential next victim. Jake was silent for a moment, feeling the weight of the revelation. Who is it? Dr. Marcus Lang, Evelyn replied. He's a university professor and has been conducting research in advanced chemistry. There might be a connection to what the alchemist was doing. Marcus Lang, Jake repeated, already grabbing his coat. I need to speak with him immediately. Send me his address. Malone drove quickly through the dark streets, the fog creating an atmosphere of suspense. He arrived at Dr. Lang's house, an imposing structure surrounded by a well-kept garden. The lights were on, indicating someone was home. Jake got out of the car and walked to the door, knocking firmly. After a few moments, the door opened, revealing a middle-aged man with glasses and a curious expression. Yes? Can I help you? Dr. Lang, I'm Detective Jake Malone. I need to talk to you about an urgent matter. Lang frowned but opened the door to let him in. Of course, come in. What is this about? Jake entered the house, noting the academic environment filled with books and scientific instruments. It's about Jonathan Blackwood. We believe you might be in danger. Lang paled at the mention of the name. Jonathan Blackwood? What does he have to do with me? He is the alchemist's son, Jake explained, watching Lang's reaction. We believe he's following in his father's footsteps and that you might be his next target. Professor Lang sat down, visibly shaken. This is disturbing. I knew Edward Blackwood. He was brilliant, but I always sensed something dark about him. I never imagined his son could be a threat. Do you know any reason why he might be targeting you? Jake asked, sitting opposite Lang. Lang thought for a moment. My research. I'm working on something Edward once mentioned, related to transforming basic materials into rare substances. Perhaps Jonathan sees this as a continuation of his father's work. Jake nodded, seeing the pieces of the puzzle come together. We need to ensure your safety, and we also need to find out where Jonathan is hiding. As Lang tried to process the situation, Jake received a message from Evelyn. Jake, I found something. Jonathan is using an old laboratory that belonged to his father. Sending the address now. Jake looked at Lang. Dr. Lang, I need you to come with me. We'll ensure your safety and then head to the laboratory. This might be where we find Jonathan. Lang agreed, still in shock but determined to help. They left the house quickly, driving towards the address Evelyn had sent. The laboratory was in an abandoned part of the city, an old building worn down by time. Arriving at the location, Jake and Lang exited the car, ready to face whatever awaited them. The building appeared empty, but a faint light shone through a dirty window. Stay behind me, Jake said, drawing his gun and moving cautiously. They entered the building, the air smelling of mold and chemicals. Walking down the corridor, Jake could hear the faint hum of equipment in operation. Finally, they reached a room where a young man was hunched over a workbench, mixing substances with frightening precision. He turned at the sound of their footsteps, revealing a pale face and cold eyes. Jonathan Blackwood? Jake asked, keeping his gun steady. The young man smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Detective Malone, I've been expecting you, and I see you brought Dr. Lang. How convenient. Jake felt the air grow heavier, the danger imminent. This ends here, Jonathan. You're not going to follow in your father's footsteps. Jonathan laughed, a joyless sound. You don't understand, detective. I'm not following in his footsteps. I'm surpassing them. Before Jake could react, Jonathan hurled a chemical substance in their direction, creating a dense, toxic cloud. Jake pulled Lang back, trying to avoid the gas, but the battle had only just begun. The confrontation in the laboratory would be decisive, and Jake knew he had to be quick and precise to prevent Jonathan from continuing his legacy of terror. The truth was finally in sight, but the path to it was fraught with danger. Chapter 7. The Enemy in the Shadows. The dense, toxic cloud spread through the laboratory, obscuring Jake and Lang's vision. The detective firmly held onto the professor's arm and quickly backed away, feeling the sting in his eyes and throat. He knew they needed to get out and find a safe place to regroup. Hold on, Jake murmured, pulling Lang into a side room. They closed the door, blocking the gas as best they could. Jake knew they didn't have much time. He scanned the room, finding a small window that opened to the outside. This way, he said, helping Lang climb out. Outside, the fresh air was a welcome relief. Jake helped Lang down, then followed. The laboratory appeared calm from the outside, but Jake knew Jonathan was still inside, plotting something. They needed a plan. Are you okay? Jake asked, panting. Lang nodded, still dazed but determined. Yes, I'm fine. But Jonathan, he's dangerous. We need to stop him. I know, said Jake, looking around. But we need reinforcements and a strategy. He's smart and has the element of surprise on his side. Grabbing his cell phone, Jake called Evelyn. Evelyn, we're at the old lab. Jonathan is here. We need immediate backup. Send units and a bomb squad. He's armed with chemical substances. Got it, Jake. Teams are on their way. Hold tight, Evelyn replied. Jake hung up and turned to Lang. We need to stay out of sight until the team arrives. We have to make sure Jonathan doesn't escape. While they waited, Jake tried to understand Jonathan's mind better. The alchemist's son had surpassed his father in skill and ambition. But what was his ultimate motivation? Was it merely a quest for power or something deeper? Finally, sirens began to wail in the distance, and the blue and red lights of police cars illuminated the street. Evelyn arrived with the team, her expression serious and determined. Jake, what do we have? She asked, joining him and Lang. Jonathan's inside using dangerous chemicals. He created a toxic cloud when we entered. We need to be careful, Jake explained. Evelyn nodded and addressed the officers. You two cover the main entrance. Bomb squad, prepare to enter with gas masks. We need to neutralize Jonathan and ensure no one else gets hurt. The team moved with precision, each person knowing exactly what to do. Jake and Evelyn followed closely, ready to act if needed. When the bomb squad breached the building, sounds of a struggle echoed, followed by tense silence. Moments later, one of the officers emerged, removing his mask. He's in custody. We neutralized the gas. It's safe to enter. Jake and Evelyn rushed inside with Lang close behind. They found Jonathan handcuffed, his face pale and cold, but his eyes still burning with hatred. Detective Malone, he said with disdain. You think you've won, but you understand nothing. My work doesn't end here. Others will continue where I left off. Jake leaned in, looking directly into Jonathan's eyes. Your reign of terror is over. You won't hurt anyone else. Jonathan only laughed, a sound more like a lament. We'll see, detective. We'll see. As Jonathan was led away, Jake and Evelyn stood in silence, absorbing the weight of what they had accomplished. The alchemist's son was finally in custody, but the impact of his crimes still reverberated through the city. Lang approached, thanking them both. Thank you for saving my life. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't arrived in time. We do what we can, said Jake, exhausted but relieved. But this isn't over yet. We need to ensure Jonathan is held accountable and that no remnants of the alchemist's legacy remain. Evelyn agreed, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder. We'll take care of it, Jake. Together, we'll make sure the city can finally rest in peace. Jake looked to the horizon, where the sun was beginning to rise, dissipating the night's fog. The battle was far from over, but for now they had won. And that was a start. With Jonathan in custody and new leads to follow, Jake knew there was still work to be done. But, for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of hope. The city could be saved, and the alchemist's legacy could finally be buried, once and for all. Chapter 8, Showdown at the Warehouse. The following days were a whirlwind of activity as Jake and Evelyn built the case against Jonathan Blackwood. Documents, evidence, and testimonies were gathered, forming a clear and condemning picture. Yet, a feeling that something was still amiss nagged at Jake. There was an unease, an inner voice whispering that the danger wasn't entirely over. Evelyn sensed this tension too. Jake, are you sure we aren't missing anything? Jonathan seems so calm, like he knows something we don't. Jake nodded, the worry evident in his eyes. Yes, he seems too confident. We need to stay vigilant. He might have left something behind. Then a new development emerged. One of Edward Blackwood's coded letters, the original Alchemist, mentioned a warehouse that had not been investigated. A place where he stored his tools of the trade. Jake knew they needed to check it out. Let's go, Evelyn. We need to check this warehouse. It might be the last piece of the puzzle. They arrived at the location late in the afternoon, an abandoned warehouse in the city's industrial zone. The place exuded an air of decay and disuse, but Jake knew appearances could be deceiving. He and Evelyn entered, the shadows lengthening as the sun set. Inside, it was dark and damp, with the smell of mold and rust predominant. Jake turned on a flashlight, illuminating the path ahead. Each step seemed to echo in the emptiness, heightening the sense of unease. Jake, look at this, Evelyn called, pointing to a series of boxes stacked against the wall. They were covered in dust, but when opened, revealed vials and laboratory equipment. These are the alchemist's tools. Jonathan must have used this. Jake examined the vials, recognizing some of the substances described in the diary. Yes, he was here, but what else could he have left behind? As they explored further, they found a safe hidden behind a stack of boxes. Jake frowned, examining the lock. This safe must contain something important, maybe the final part of Jonathan's plan. We need to open it, Evelyn said, already calling the tech team for assistance. While they waited, the tension in the air seemed to build. Jake looked at Evelyn, both aware that something significant was about to unfold. Finally, the team arrived and managed to open the safe. Inside, there were more documents and a small chemical bomb, armed and ready to detonate. "He planned this," Evelyn said, horror in her voice. "Jonathan wanted to lure us here and destroy everything." Jake looked at the bomb, his mind racing. "We need to disarm it. And quickly." As the bomb squad worked frantically, Jake examined the documents. Among them, a letter from Jonathan, addressed to him. "Detective Malone, if you are reading this, then my plans have been partially thwarted. But know that my father's legacy will not die with me. Others will follow in my footsteps, and you will never be completely safe. This bomb is just a reminder that there will always be shadows where there is light. Jonathan Blackwood." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Jonathan had played one last card, trying to ensure his legacy continued. But Jake wouldn't allow it. The bomb squad finally managed to deactivate the bomb, and a collective sigh of relief filled the air. "We did it," Evelyn said, visibly relieved. "But we need to make sure all loose ends are tied up. We can't leave any chance for this legacy to continue." Jake agreed. "Let's comb through everything. We need to ensure every trace of Jonathan and Edward's work is destroyed." As the team continued the inspection, Jake reflected on the recent events. The showdown at the warehouse had been a grim reminder that evil can persist in the shadows, but it also showcased the strength of determination and justice. With Jonathan in custody and his last plan foiled, the city could finally breathe a bit easier. But Jake knew vigilance was crucial. The fight against darkness never truly ended, but he was ready to face any challenge that came, always seeking the light amidst the darkness. And so, with the warehouse secured and the Alchemist's legacy finally confronted, Jake and Evelyn stepped out into the cold night, aware that they had taken a crucial step in the fight against the evil that plagued the city. Chapter 9. The Truth Comes to Light. Jake Malone felt the weight of the recent weeks as he walked through the city streets, the night shadows partially concealing his weary figure. The showdown at the warehouse had been intense, but he knew the battle was not yet fully won. There was one last piece of the puzzle that needed to be uncovered. A secret Edward Blackwood had kept so well that even his own son had not been able to uncover it. Back at the office, Jake spread the documents from the safe across his desk. Jonathan's notes, Edward's diagrams, and the threatening letter. Something still didn't add up, and he needed to find the thread that tied all the pieces together. As he studied the pages, the phone rang. It was Evelyn. "Jake, I found something that might be of interest," she said, her voice filled with urgency. "There's a man who worked with Edward, a chemist named Dr. Henry Whitaker. He's in a nursing home on the outskirts of the city. I think he might have information we need." "I'm on my way," Jake replied, already grabbing his coat and heading out into the cold night. The nursing home was an old, well-kept building situated in a quiet neighborhood. Jake was led to Dr. Whitaker's room, where he found an elderly man with a frail appearance, but eyes that still sparkled with intelligence. "Dr. Whitaker," Jake began, introducing himself. "I'm Detective Jake Malone. I'm investigating the case of Edward Blackwood, the Alchemist. I need your help." Whitaker's eyes narrowed at the mention of the name. "Edward. It's been years since I heard that name. What do you want to know, Detective?" "Everything you can tell me," Jake said, "especially about his work and any secrets he might have kept. His son, Jonathan, tried to continue his legacy, but I believe there's something more, something Edward never revealed." Whitaker sighed, adjusting himself in the chair. Edward was a genius, but also a tormented man. He always talked about achieving the final transformation, an alchemical concept. He believed he could transform the very essence of humanity, achieve a form of immortality through chemistry. Jake leaned in, intrigued. "Immortality? That sounds like a delusion." "Perhaps it was," said Whitaker. "But he was obsessed. There was a notebook, a personal diary where he kept all his most secret research. I believe Jonathan never found it. That diary could contain answers." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "And where is this diary?" Whitaker looked out the window, thoughtful. Edward used to hide his things in the place where it all began. The old Blackwood family home, now in ruins. If he hid anything important, it would be there. Thanking the old scientist, Jake left the nursing home with renewed determination. The old Blackwood house was his next destination, a place where the secrets of the past could finally come to light. Arriving at the abandoned house, Jake felt the oppressive atmosphere of the place. The building was in ruins, overgrown with vegetation and time. But he knew he had to enter. Armed with a flashlight and his gun, Jake explored the dusty corridors, looking for any clue that might lead to Edward's diary. Finally, in the basement of the house, he found a hidden compartment behind a bookcase. Forcing it open, Jake discovered a metal box. Inside, wrapped in old cloth, was the diary. Its pages were yellowed but intact. Jake began to flip through the diary, his eyes absorbing Edward's complex notes. Advanced chemical formulas, philosophical reflections on the nature of life and death, and finally, a detailed plan for the final transformation. Edward believed he could transcend mortality, but his methods were dark and dangerous. As he read, Jake found a passage that chilled him. Edward planned to use his own son as the subject for his final experiments, believing the transformation needed a young catalyst. Jonathan never knew this. He had been trying to honor a legacy he never fully understood. With the diary in hand, Jake knew he had the final piece. He needed to confront Jonathan with this truth. The next day, he and Evelyn went to the prison where Jonathan was being held. Sitting face to face in the visitor's room, Jake placed the diary on the table. "Jonathan, you think you were continuing your father's work, but there's something you need to know. Edward planned to use you as an experiment. Everything you did was based on a lie." Jonathan looked at the diary, his expression shifting from arrogance to confusion and finally to shock. "This can't be true," he murmured, flipping through the pages. "It is the truth," Jake said firmly. "You were manipulated by your father's legacy. Now it's up to you to decide how to move forward. The legacy ends here, or you find a way to do something good with the knowledge you have." Jonathan closed the diary, his face a mask of internal conflict. Jake knew the battle within him would be long, but he hoped the truth might bring some redemption. As they left the prison, Evelyn looked at Jake. "Do you think he'll change?" "I don't know," Jake replied, looking at the horizon. "But at least now he has a chance to choose. And that's a start." The truth had come to light, and with it, the hope that the darkness could finally be dispelled. Jake felt that, despite everything, they had taken a crucial step in fighting the demons of the past, allowing the city to finally begin to heal. Chapter 10. The End of a Legacy. The morning was calm and clear, a rare respite from the sequence of dark events that had enveloped the city. Jake Malone felt the weight of the past weeks as he looked out the window of his office, watching the city slowly awaken. The Alchemist's legacy had been confronted, but there were still questions to be answered, wounds to be healed. Evelyn entered the office, bringing 2 cups of coffee. "Here you go, Jake. I thought you could use a break." "Thanks, Evelyn," he said, taking the cup. "These past weeks have been intense, but I feel like we're finally seeing the light at the end of the tunnel." Evelyn nodded, sitting in the chair opposite Jake's desk. "Yes, but there's still a lot of work to do. Jonathan is in custody, but the impact of the Alchemist's crimes still reverberates through the city. We need to ensure that the full truth comes out and that justice is served." Jake took a sip of coffee, reflecting. "You're right, and we need to help the city recover. Educate people. Make sure they understand what happened and how to prevent something like this from happening again." As they discussed the next steps, Jake's phone rang. It was a call from the director of the nursing home where Dr. Henry Whitaker was staying. "Detective Malone, I need to speak with you about Dr. Whitaker. He's very ill and has requested to see you one last time. He said there's something important he needs to tell you." Jake felt a pang in his heart. "I'm on my way." Arriving at the nursing home, Jake was led straight to Whitaker's room. The old scientist looked even more frail than the last time, his eyes tired but still full of wisdom. "Dr. Whitaker," Jake said, sitting beside the bed. "What do you need to tell me?" Whitaker took a deep breath, gathering his strength. Jake, there's something you need to know about Edward's diary. There's a formula, the last note he made. It's the key to the final transformation, but it's incredibly dangerous. Jonathan may not have fully understood it, but others could try to use it. Jake frowned. You think this information could fall into the wrong hands? Yes, Whitaker replied, his voice weak. This formula must be destroyed. Cannot exist in the world. It's too dangerous. Promise me you'll do it, Jake. Jake nodded, determined. I promise, Dr. Whitaker. I won't let this formula be used for evil. Whitaker closed his eyes, a smile of relief spreading across his face. Thank you, Jake. Now I can rest in peace. Jake stayed by Whitaker's side until the end, feeling the responsibility grow in his chest. With the promise made, he knew he had to keep his word. Back at his office, Jake took out Edward's diary and found the formula Whitaker had mentioned. He studied it for a moment, seeing the destructive potential it held. With a sigh, he removed the page and burned it, watching the flames consume the paper. Evelyn entered the office as Jake watched the ashes. Is it done? Yes, Jake said, turning to her. I destroyed the formula. There's no more danger. Evelyn nodded, relieved. Good. Now we can focus on helping the city recover. In the following days, Jake and Evelyn worked tirelessly to restore order and safety. They organized talks and seminars, shared information with the public, and ensured that all evidence was presented in court so Jonathan and any accomplices were properly judged. The city began to heal slowly but surely. People returned to the streets with a renewed sense of safety, knowing that the Alchemist's legacy had been finally confronted and defeated. Jake felt a deep relief, but also a renewed determination. He knew there would always be new challenges, new threats, but he also knew he was ready to face them. On a quiet evening, as he walked through the now peaceful streets, Jake met Clara, Edward Blackwood's widow. She was standing in front of a memorial erected for the Alchemist's victims, an expression of sadness mixed with relief on her face. Clara, Jake said, approaching her. Detective Malone, she replied, turning to him. Thank you for everything you've done. My son, Jonathan, I know he's being punished for what he did, but I still hope he finds a path to redemption. He has a chance, Jake said, looking at the memorial. And that's more than many could hope for. Clara nodded, tears in her eyes. I hope we can all find peace now. Jake stood beside her in silence, reflecting on the journey they had taken. The fight against darkness never truly ended, but he knew that each victory, no matter how small, made a difference. And so, with the city finally beginning to heal and a new dawn breaking on the horizon, Jake Malone was ready to face whatever came next, always seeking the light amidst the shadows. The Alchemist's legacy had come to an end, and a new era of hope and justice was just beginning.